Welcome to our third tutorial around Unit 401, Managing Responsible Selling. And this tutorial is all about Learning Outcome 3. Now, in the previous two tutorials, we were discussing Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 2. Learning Outcome 1 is really helping you understand what are the policies and procedures that we as salespeople and organisations selling need to comply to. Learning Outcome 2 was really how do you ensure that your salespeople understand the policies, how do you monitor that they are complying with the policies, and then thirdly, how do we support them in any knowledge gaps that they have. So let's take a look at Learning Outcome 3.1, which is identifying and correcting any failures that we have to meet the requirements. So conformity and non-conformity issues within a company should be dealt with at management level. And this should be both through proactive and reactive responses. It is important to recognise that denial is not an option. You can't put your head in the sand on this one. Every organisation should establish a compliance monitoring programme which is effective, ongoing, and well documented, particularly in the event of any complaint about a legal, regulatory, ethical and social requirement. Without a compliance monitoring program, it can be very difficult to identify and correct the failures to comply. So pretty much you can't do this unless you have one of these. So let's talk about the compliance monitoring system. Your compliance monitoring system should contain the following things. First of all, it should have a compliance testing process. So how do you know your organisation has been following the procedures and policies? What are all the procedures you need to follow? Have they been put in place? Have they been identified? Have they been written down? Are those procedures, are they working as expected? And are there any exceptions to this? You should build up a history and a profile to demonstrate that you are in fact following these requirements. So we need to think about the process and need to think about documenting that process. Frequency. Well, what do we mean by compliance testing frequency? Well, how often should the compliance test be carried out? Should that be every week? Should it be every month? Maybe once a quarter? Is it an annual thing? There is a fair amount of subjectivity around this, and it would be advisable to determine in a methodical way what you perceive to be the risks of something failing. So if there's a high risk of something failing, then obviously a shorter frequency, a sort of shorter time period and an increased frequency would obviously be advisable. A simple assessment should include the probability of failure and the impact that would result from it. So if the impact of failure is relatively small, then obviously we don't need to assess quite as often. But if that one impact of failure is huge to your organisation, we've got to be absolutely very clear. So for example, high risk areas could be tested more regularly, at least monthly, medium risk areas at least quarterly, lower risk areas could be on a yearly basis. Let's take a look at the next one. So what is your approach? So what do we mean by compliance testing approach? Well, a methodical approach will reap rewards later. So using a checklist of tests, and I guess more importantly, categorizing those tests are absolutely vital. Tests should be completed clearly, concisely, and accurately using reasonable sample sizes. So it's not a case of waiting for it to go wrong, it's a case of constantly testing and ensuring that you use a reasonable sample size that will give an accurate indication of whether you are actually delivering what needs to be delivered. Let's move on. Documentation. Well, compliance documentation is absolutely essential to demonstrate you are monitoring compliance, and in certain circumstances you will need impartial documented evidence to back up non-conformance instances. So ideally documents should be indexed or refer to the procedures and policies to allow an easy follow through of all tests and results. So we've taken the approach, we know how often we're doing it, there's a process there, but absolutely documenting this is vital to the process. The next one, the follow-up and the follow-up actions. Once you have identified any failures, you need to think about what steps should be taken to address them and who will take those steps. If there are follow-up points and further queries and questions, it would also be good practice to record, to document these and to link them to the corresponding procedures and policies. And of course, as with all of this, a timely response is absolutely key to doing that. So that very much talks about how we put together a compliance monitoring system. If we take a look at Learning Outcome 3.2, which is explain how and when to provide full reports about any failures to meet requirements to senior management. So when do we now say, okay, this non-compliance is serious enough that we need to put together a report and send it up? So assuming you have a compliance monitoring process in place, it will then become clear of when and how you should be reporting to senior management on any failures. So your compliance monitoring process should include the following statements. So you should have compliance history. You should be able to refer to your compliance history in 3.1, as we mentioned before, to identify any failures. This should be properly documented. You should consider the use of compliance management software. Whichever method you use, and that's up to you, but there should be a centralized location housing all compliance needs, including policy and procedure management, training, tests, surveys, and that should all be within one system to assist the monitoring. But what are the procedures for non-compliance? Well, if people do not meet legal and regulatory requirements, procedures should be established to identify and address the failures. Procedures should include a time frame for investigation and response. The procedures should be clear and they should be accessible. But what about investigation? So, it's important to identify reasons for not meeting any necessary requirements. It helps to refer back to the requirements, the processes which the organisation has in place, any training, any support, anything that's really needed to help that individual. The hows, the whys, the what exactly failed, the date it happened, the frequency it's happening, and any particular sector of staff that's responsible. So there's certain areas of our company that are consistently non-complying. And then of course we need the actual report itself. Full reports will enable senior management to clearly understand any breaches of requirements. Reports should be provided on a regular basis and should refer to the legal and regulatory requirements in place. Executive summaries can be helpful, of course, because some executives like to just read the headlines. But of course, the level of reporting detail may need to increase where a serious failure has occurred. In those instances, referring to the organisational procedures, the policies, the processes in place to ensure their implementation would be useful, and talk about how they were breached, why this happened, together with any suggestions for internal policy reviews. So, let's assume there are things that we can change. What are the revisions that we need to put into place? Well, policies and procedures may need to be revised in the event of failure to meet the requirements. And this is done in order to reduce the likelihood of failures in the future, of course, and to make sure that policies and procedures continue to be effective and properly understood across the whole of the organisation. Further training and support for staff may, of course, be needed if that is the case. And then, lastly, what are our follow-up actions? Well, the organisation should consider what other follow-up actions are required and how and when to implement them. For example, are there any disciplinary procedures that are required based on the report? So that's when we start to get very serious. So I guess sort of leading on from here, senior management are ultimately responsible for compliance. And so it's important that conformity and non-conformity issues are properly communicated. How does this happen within your organisation? Are your senior managers absolutely in control of compliance? And does the buck stop there? Do they absolutely take responsibility for what's going on? So let's move on to learning outcome 3.3. And this is how to monitor and manage complaints regarding to the requirements. So in the event of a complaint, for example, from a customer, a company should ensure that there is a basic process in place to ensure that the complaint is properly managed and monitored in a timely fashion. We've said that throughout the whole of Unit 401. A properly documented centralised system will obviously help that. Again, drafting a formal procedure certainly helps, and this should be communicated to staff across the business and made available to the customer, of course. Here's an example of a basic process that you may use or may think of using. So, what happens when we get the complaint? So, the details of any complaint should be fully documented and dated, of course. We should then acknowledge the complaint. It should have an initial response to the complainant, i.e. the customer, if that's the case, detailing the process to be taken and when exactly they can expect to hear something. So what's the likely time frame that will be involved? There will then, of course, be an investigation. The complaint is investigated with reference to the legal, regulatory, ethical and social requirements and the organisation's compliance monitoring system. So this will all be in line with the compliance management system that we discussed earlier in this learning outcome. Then, of course, there is a decision. So the complaint is either upheld or not upheld, whichever the case may be. You then need to file a report. So a report detailing the decision and findings should be drafted. It may be necessary, of course, to communicate this to a number of relevant stakeholders. This could be the complainant, the management, there could be external stakeholders involved, or there may be, of course, staff members involved. And then, what are the actions? So, is there any further action to be taken? And what steps should be taken, if there is, and when would these actions be taken? And lastly, of course, we may not be happy about the decision. So what is the appeals procedure? An organisation may wish to include an appeal process, particularly where external stakeholders and complainants are likely. So just because we've said that there's no action doesn't mean to say someone else doesn't should think that. So I guess the thing to think about here is, how does your organisation monitor and manage complaints? Do you have this process? Is it documented? If not, we really need to think about how we do that. So, as we know, on previous tutorials, we spoke about learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 2. This is the 2,000 to 3,000 word assignment that you need to write, and it's a report to your managers because they want to make sure they are best in class in terms of compliance within your industry. The first task was very much about understanding the laws and understanding the code of practice relating to your industry. The second part, the second part of the first part was how we deal with misrepresentation and what impact would there be on the organisation if there was misrepresentation, people not complying, and what advice would you give to the management in terms of making sure that we do comply. The second task was all about how we educate your staff, how do you educate the salespeople regarding the policies, how you then monitor that as a company, and how you then help them fill in the gaps if they're not complying. So what do we need to do in this area? So as we've discussed throughout this tutorial, this is the third learning outcome is all about non-compliance. So the first thing to really address, how would you identify and correct any failure from your organisation? We then need to think about how and when would it be appropriate for you to provide a full report to your managers, to your bosses, I guess. And then lastly, how do you monitor and document that complaint? So what is the process? Do you have one in place? If you don't, what process do you need in place to make sure that from the time that you get the complaint or the non-compliance, you take it through to a decision, to actions, and then of course to appeal if that is necessary. So this concludes the third tutorial and indeed the final tutorial of Unit 401, which is Managing Responsible Selling. If you have any queries whatsoever, we urge you to contact us at www.lemore.com. If you need information to be able to qualify for this unit and what documentation you need to submit, again, please contact us. So have fun reading around this subject. I hope that you've taken a lot from the actual tutorials, and that indeed, as well as learning to be able to pass the task, you've actually been able to implement something in your everyday practice as well. So thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.